I made a slight change to my subtitle of the presentation, which is earlier it was specifically about the pandemic, but now I have made it to state and labor law reforms, engineering precarity. So I'll give a context about the recent labor law reforms which have been passed in Parliament last year in India. These laws have been in the making for the past 7 years, and how pandemic was used as an opportunity to introduce these new changes, and how different states have come forward with these changes in order to make this the provinces or states, I use them interchangeably, more competitive. So what is the rationale for these labor law reforms that I'm going to talk about? So in India, economic reforms were introduced in 1991. So we moved from an import substitution industrialization to an open and liberalized economy to deal with balance of payment crisis, debt, and so on. But it was about product market, goods and services. So economists, policymakers, and especially industrial bodies, they started demanding second generation reforms. That's what it's called. And they demanded changes in labor laws and farm laws to align with changes to align with reforms which were introduced in 1991 and respond to a globalized economy with an increase in competition, right? So the farm laws have already been implemented. There is a year-long protest going on against these laws. So what is the crux of these demands? Flexibility in labor laws. So hire and fire, relocation of plants, technological change, employment of contract workers in core activities, which was prohibited earlier. And all these activities to take place without any kind of state intervention, right? There were National Commission for Labor, Second National Commission for Labor in 2002, then Planning Commission Task Force. A lot of policy-making bodies introduced or supported these demands by proponents of labor market reforms to rectify the supposedly rigidity of the market. But not much movement could happen because of absence of political support for these changes and the compulsions of a coalition politics, which meant that no single political party was in power after 1991. So the government at the center were all coalition governments. So there are a lot of pulls and pressures, and it was just not possible to go through these labor reforms, which had become a very sensitive issue. And at times the left political parties also supported the central government. So it became very difficult. But things changed really fast after the current government, BJP-led government, Bharatiya Janata Party-led government, which came to power in 2014 with a clear majority. And the process for these reforms got underway. Ease of doing business, going up in World Bank ranking and Make in India. So the purpose was to make India a manufacturing powerhouse, ostensibly to compete with China. So what these reforms did, they amalgamated 44 central labor laws into 4 labor codes. So there was code on wages, industrial relations code, code on social security and occupational safety, health and working conditions. There are several contentious features in these codes. A concept called fixed term employment was introduced. Jobs can be terminated without any benefits for these workers. The state governments, the provincial governments, they were free to fix normal working day, right? So it could be increased from 8 hours to 12 hours, 9 hours, 10 hours. It's up to these state governments. Instead of collective bargaining, collective bargaining is there in these changes in these new laws, but they have also introduced something called individual bargaining. An employer can enter into an agreement with one worker, a couple of workers, 5 or 10 or 15. So it really defeats the purpose of collective bargaining, the spirit of collective bargaining. A contentious feature of the erstwhile labor laws was this, what is called threshold of workers, meaning if a firm which employs 100 workers or more than 100 workers, if it wants to retrench workers or close its plant or relocate, it would require permission from the government, right? So that threshold has been increased to 300 workers, meaning there was a survey done in Mumbai, and out of 5,000 plants firms, only 500 to 700 firms had more than 300 workers, right? So a lot of firms could just close down, relocate, retrench workers without any permission from the government. Strikes have been made more difficult. Conciliation has been made mandatory, and if it is drawn on for too long, at least 2 months, before that, no legal strike call can be given. And in fact, fine or imprisonment can also happen for participating in or inciting an illegal strike, right? So they have introduced labor tribunals instead of labor courts, and the government, the executive, can override tribunal decisions. So these are some of the anti-worker features. And these laws, these changes have been introduced partially by several state governments, especially by BJP-ruled state governments since 2014, Rajasthan, Madhya Pradesh, and so on. So the pandemic provided a perfect opportunity for other states, there are like 28 states, to roll out these reforms through executive decisions, through the route of ordinance, instead of passing them through legislation, instead of going through consultation process with the trade unions. They came up with several changes through ordinances, and in order to create more employment opportunities and deal with the situation, the crisis that pandemic had brought about. Right. I mean, India declared a brutal lockdown. Millions of migrants were on the streets and so on. So just after 15 days of the lockdown, these ordinances were started to come in. The first was, they increased the working hours from 8 hours to 12 hours, and 48 hours to 72 hours a week with no overtime pay. Industrial Disputes Acts were suspended, Minimum Wages Act was suspended, Workplace Safety Acts were suspended. The Code on Wages had introduced a concept called National Floor Wage, which is like 178 rupees, which meant basically below $3, 3 USD a day. So that became the basis, and it helped the employers, right? It helped the employers to keep the wage low because a national floor wage had been set, right? So it would be difficult for workers to go to a court and challenge these low wages. Again, I mean, the threshold of applicability was increased, meaning firms which had more than 300 workers need permission of the state for plant closure and so on, but plants with less than 300 workers cannot do that. I mean, are free to do that. And this threshold can be increased even further. Should there be a need? For example, pandemic provided an opportunity. Some states went ahead with increasing the threshold to 500 workers. So large number of firms were free to hire and fire, to retrench, to relocate, and not make any workers permanent. So with workers without any contract, right? So what is the existing state of labor laws? Why was there a need for this kind of reforms in the last 6-7 years? The existing state of labor reforms is not a very rosy picture. In India, the organized sector is really small, which is like 7%. Unorganized sector is 93%. Several of the old laws did not were not implemented on the ground. For instance, let's say in the case of the famous Maruti Suzuki India Limited case, in 2012, over 2,500 workers were fired in clear violation of existing labor laws. State did not intervene. In the organized sector, increasingly in the majority of the firms, contract workers constitute over 70 to 90% of the workforce. For instance, auto industry. In the garment sector, the number is even higher. Labor disputes in labor courts and high courts, they are long drawn and they're pending for years. Union formation is more difficult now because of coercive actions, in new industrial clusters. Special economic zones, export processing zones, industrial model township, these spatial locations, they have already been excluded from the implementation of labor laws. So what was the need for these reforms? And which, of course, pandemic accelerated these laws, and implementation began to happen. So it has to be seen in the broader framework of a neoliberal policy agenda, which is there is a large scale, this massive push for privatization in India is going on: banking, insurance, defense, airlines, railways, infrastructure. There's a lot of monetization of government assets. I would argue that the government wants to preempt any resistance to huge job loss, which is just a matter of time because of large-scale privatization. Second, there's a lot of worker participation in general strikes and emergence of plant-based militant strikes happening. My point is that the state is trying to preempt these efforts of resistance, and second, it wants to make India a base for a low-wage space for low-wage capitalism to attract investment, to make it a powerhouse, and so on. And which is, of course, based on a lot of faulty assumptions that only labor laws or supposedly rigidity of labor laws, if these can be corrected, with other factors being constant, India can really become a manufacturing powerhouse. So what is interesting also to see here is the scalar nature of reforms. This pandemic showed us the way that different states introduced these reforms at different stages. So united trade union movement became just next to impossible. So trade unions in the respective states dealt with their own state governments. So the movement was fragmented. Of course, there is this call for general strikes every year where millions of workers participate, but they have not been able to stall the implementation of or passage of these laws in the parliament. So the idea here is to crush any possible resistance and whatever is left of the organized labor.
Hi, everyone. I'm Joseph Fantauzzi. I'm a PhD candidate in the Department of Politics at York University. My research is on the political economy of Ontario with a special focus on contemporary crises. Today, I'm going to talk about alienation and labor, specifically my argument that alienation has intensified during the pandemic. When I talk about alienation, I'm talking about how Marx describes it in the Economic and Philosophic Manuscripts of 1844. That is, how we relate to what we produce and its effects on us as a species. I've structured this discussion into three parts. First, I'll speak briefly about Marx's theory of alienation, why I believe it's necessary to return to that theory at this stage. Second, I'll describe concrete examples from both Canada and around the world of what I understand to be evidence that alienation among workers has intensified during the pandemic and the roles played by ideology in the state. Third, I'll explore what I perceive to be examples of resistance to intensified alienation, specifically bursts of worker consciousness through work refusals and calls for mass disruption. So let's start with alienation, a term I'll use interchangeably with estrangement. In the manuscripts, Marx tells us the alienation of waged workers is preconditioned by their creation and reproduction as a commodity. Marx tells us waged labor alienates people in four ways. Firstly, as workers alienated from the objects they produce. This means the more a human being works to produce something, the more of themselves are contained in that thing. When the object of a worker's labor is appropriated by another person, the worker loses the object they've produced and it becomes someone else's property. When this occurs daily, workers are confined to a system that requires the reproduction of this object forfeiture. And secondly, alienation arises as workers become estranged from the production process due to their need to survive. When wage labor exists, workers fulfill a production need in a process they perceive as out of their control. They earn money to satisfy their own daily requirements. Here, waged workers repeatedly produce something for someone else. they're alienated from producing what they would truly wish to, or expressing themselves through production. Thirdly, as people alienated from their species essence. Humanity is tied to nature physically and socially, and is a unique species in Marx's eyes, since what it produces comes to reflect its own socially developed processes. What humans produce is often beautiful, he tells us, and it can mirror the essence of our species' authentic life. The alienation that comes with wage labor severs this connection to human essence and systematizes production for a single purpose. And fourthly, humans estranged from other humans. Alienated waged workers are socialized to view other people as alienated waged workers and treat them like that. That is, according to the social regime of alienated production, commodified objects, and potentially useful for producing things that can be appropriated for personal gain. In complex societies, this is all backed by the state, and it's reinforced by dominant ideologies. So in terms of the pandemic intensifying alienation, as workers estranged from the objects they produce, I'll point to the shift in online production. Both the OECD and Statistics Canada confirm working from home increased substantially in many countries during the pandemic. These changes were largely driven by specific sectors. Some jobs like public administration can easily move to online production, and some others, such as agriculture, cannot. Arguably, one of the under-theorized effects of prolonged online production is how it increasingly leaves workers represented by what they produce. During the pandemic, not only is the worker's object of production lost, but this loss is actually not occurring in the material world. Technology mediates this, and how it mediates it has increased substantially on a social scale. Workers are one step further removed from seeing the object of their labor truly belong to them. In other words, on a social scale, email attachments with the day's work intensify alienation because that work is not handed to another human being. It's fired off into a black hole in the internet. As to pandemic intensifying the alienation of workers from production, workers continue to need wages to obtain necessities, and workers in sectors not easily moved online have continued laboring in person. Some of these employees include supermarket employees and agricultural laborers. They've been designated essential in many cases. Literature is rife at this point with evidence that these jobs designated essential are disproportionately gendered, precarious, and staffed in the global north, especially by workers from historically marginalized communities. As an example, temporary migrant farm workers in Canada were designated essential because of the crucial labor they provide in assuring the food supply. But little was done to improve the cramped conditions in which these workers live, making it impossible for them to socially distance. The consequences of this exploded into view in 2020 at a farm in Victoria, Ontario. A COVID-19 outbreak there infected more than 100 workers and killed one of them, a 55-year-old man from Mexico employed as a migrant worker. The point here is that workers continue to need wages to live. The state has designated some of them essential, but little to nothing has been done by the state to reflect that status. Thus, a severe contradiction has emerged. By attempting to maintain their lives through precarious alienated labor with zero control over production, the workers have put their lives at risk from viral infection in a way that is qualitatively different and arguably heightened on a social scale than before the pandemic. With regard to alienation of the species essence during the pandemic, I think it's helpful to talk here about two examples of how work, labor, and the economy have been discussed. The first is what I'll call business as usual. This is the idea that nothing is to change, or that there is nothing to worry about. And this was much more prevalent during the early days of the pandemic, such as in early 2020, when two senior presidential advisors in the United States publicly claimed the virus was essentially contained. Sanford et al. 2020 also identified the sluggish movement of large bureaucracies and huge organizations as cementing pandemic business as usual. Second is what I'll call return to normal. And this is the idea that societies must return to pre-pandemic practices, and it's often linked to restarting the economy. One example is what's called the Great Barrington Declaration, an October 2020 letter signed by doctors and academics, which argues those not vulnerable to COVID-19 should immediately be allowed to resume, quote, life as normal. And this includes reopening businesses. Return to normal is also seen in neoliberal pandemic state policy, such as how income support programs are often time limited and subject to reductions, or government plans to focus on economic reopening quickly after emergencies are declared, such as what happened in Ontario in 2020. So combined, the ideologies of business as usual and return to normal entrench a romanticized view of alienated pre-pandemic life. And they work to proscribe discussions about more fundamentally redistributive economic and political alternatives to the alienation that existed before the pandemic. And this gets humanity no closer to its species essence. In terms of humans estranged from other humans as alienated workers, the key example of this is the divide in the working class I identified earlier. Between those permitted to work at home and those required to work in person. Not only is the working class already alienated in 4 ways generally, but specific forms of alienation for workers has intensified. This has arguably severely fragmented the working class during the pandemic, as the daily alienation workers in each group must confront is different. It's reproduced hierarchies of workers, which are gendered, racialized, and precaritized. It's difficult to believe one group of workers is not aware of the other group. Certainly, many at-home workers relied on the labor of the in-person workers to farm, shelve, and very often deliver their food during lockdowns. Finally, I'll talk briefly about worker resistance during the pandemic. From the calls by some Italian labor unions for a general strike in non-essential sectors over industry's handling of the pandemic, to essential retail workers in the United States who engaged in widespread job action over pandemic working conditions, to condemnations by Ontario labor groups of the province's market-focused pandemic recovery plan, there is evidence of widespread pandemic-related worker consciousness. This reveals workers have not simply accepted the changing conditions of work and the intensifying alienation. And this is, I think, key to understanding class consciousness among the workers at this moment and solidarities built during crises generally. Indeed, if there is to be any transcending of the forms of alienation Marx described in 1848, which I argue have substantially intensified during the pandemic, it may very well result from heightened class consciousness that can perceive ongoing qualitative changes in alienation, along with new solidarities on the ground among workers and the creation of political formations that will ultimately arise from those solidarities. This informed action will be crucial to developing forms of work and labor that do not estrange workers from their human species essence. And it will be central to any efforts to create a society constructed upon a social foundation that is more redistributive and more cooperative. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. I'm Sanjana Rahman, a first-year master's student at York University Political Science. And the paper I'm presenting today is a critique of the celebratory narrative of the 2022 World Cup in Qatar. Growing up in a family and friend circle of football fans and also being Bangladeshi, this topic is very important to me because though I am excited for the World Cup in the coming year, Bangladesh is also one of the top sending countries of migrant workers who are building the World Cup infrastructure in Qatar, and a lot of whom are hyper precarious and are subjected to exploitation, which are often concealed in the positive narratives of the World Cup. So since the announcement in 2010 of Qatar's win host the event, there's the opportunity for the nation to experience rapid urban development, infrastructure upgrades, job creations, tourism, and also for the first time for a Middle Eastern country to host a mega event. Mainstream media, as well as some academic articles, celebrated the opportunity for Qatar to amend its reputation as a nation that practices exploitative treatment of migrant workers. But the toxic combination of Qatar's historical record of human rights violations and the high inflow of migrant workers to accommodate its opportunity to host a look at the economic gains of hosting the mega event. So I wrote this paper because I was interested in looking at what gets left out in these narratives and what the costs of attaining the benefits of hosting the World Cup are. I do this by critically examining some of the main claims put forth by the celebratory narratives by utilizing a historical materialist analysis of Qatar's political economy. So I'll talk a bit about the political and economic influence of the Qatari ruling family, the Al Thani, and discuss how capital accumulation has created a large demand for labor, which has been mostly met by an army of precarious migrant workers. I also look at the political action and inaction of the state that contribute to the exploitation of these migrants in the form of systemically exploitative labor laws and inadequate reforms to these laws. And I'll discuss these topics with the intention of placing the World Cup within this historical understanding of Qatar's political economy to critique the narratives that only discuss the benefits of hosting the mega event. So before continuing to the analysis section, I wanted to highlight some of the benefits put forth in these articles. One of the most common claims is that the event will leave a positive mark on Qatar's economy as it'll generate countless jobs and improve the infrastructure and entertainment facilities. So Brookings Institution, for example, stated that the World Cup will have a positive impact on Qatar, estimating an increase of up to 25% in short-term employment. Oxford Business Group stated that the World Cup is expected to have a substantial positive impact on the Qatari economy before, during, and long after the event itself, and will generate countless jobs in the medium term. Articles also commend Qatar for taking steps towards protecting its migrant workers through revised labor laws and the introduction of minimum wages in view of the World Cup. However, the problem with these narratives is that they treat the mega event as an entity that is independent of the host country's wider historical and political context. And as I discussed later on, Qatar's treatment of migrant workers throughout its history cannot be overlooked while discussing the impact of the mega event taking place within the country. So claiming something like the World Cup will have a substantial positive impact before the event itself requires a critical lens on what is actually going on within the decade of preparation of the World Cup. So as I mentioned, it's imperative to look at the historical context of the country within which the tournament is taking place. The countries in the Persian Gulf region experience a substantial polarization of wealth and power in the hands of a few, and in parallel, an extraordinary level of exploitation, displacement, and class conflict. In Qatar, this can be in part attributed to the powerful family of emirs, the Al Thani, who have been ruling for decades before Qatar's independence in 1971. And they play an important role in making capital accumulation in the country highly fluid between the private and public spheres. So for example, of the 45 firms listed on the Qatari Stock Exchange, a staggering 80% have at least one member of the Al Thani family on the board. And these members occupy their board positions not as representatives of the state, but in private capacity. This dynamic therefore make the Al Thani an important part of the capitalist class in Qatar and affords them power over the country's political and economic spheres. In the mid-90s and early 2000s, the then Emir Hamad Al Thani transformed Qatar into a major world power by continuing to exploit the country's vast oil fields and building the world's largest LNG terminal, which gave rise to a large amount of surplus capital. This surplus capital was then reinvested into the economy in the form of extravagant skyscrapers, restaurants, entertainment facilities, which led to a drastic transformation in the country's labor market and created a high demand for labor. Now, from a historical materialist perspective, we have to look at the mode of production as well as the relations of production that have historically transformed Qatar society. Due to its relatively small domestic labor force, the demand was largely met by migrant workers. And as a result, Qatar had a large army of temporary, precarious migrant workers, particularly in the construction and domestic work sectors. So it's not surprising that the World Cup construction is also being undertaken largely by migrant workers. And what we see here in Marxist terms is that the accumulation of capital is reproducing capitalist social relations, and that the growth of capital is giving way to the growth of a working class. Now, in the context of this historical backdrop, I look at the mechanisms and labor laws in place that determine the status of migrant workers in Qatar. I should say first, though, that there have been reforms to some of these labor laws, which I'll touch upon later on in my presentation. But a large portion of the migrants have been going to Qatar since 2010 for the World Cup. So it's still vital to to discuss the previous iterations of the legal system. Much like other countries in the Gulf region, historically, migrant workers have been employed in Qatar through what is known as the kafala system, which is a sponsorship mechanism in which migrant workers are required to have an in-country sponsor who is typically their employer. This employer would then have the authority to allow or disallow migrant workers to change jobs, to receive an exit permit to leave the country, to rent places to stay in, or even to open a bank account. This power dynamic has therefore given rise to unfree labor who are forced to give in to their employers' exploitative practices. So for example, a common case is that employers will confiscate the passports of the workers, and workers are forced to sign false documents claiming that their employers have paid them the due wages in order to have their passports returned. So we see that policies had been formed in a way that inhibit workers' abilities to exert rights. So what materializes here is a long-standing history of structural exploitation in which migrants are systemically tied to their employers. Workers are also constrained within Qatar's newly built labor city, which is a migrant camp built specifically in light of the large inflow of World Cup workers. Now, while celebratory articles were published applauding Qatar's commitment to its migrant workers by providing them with living quarters and amenities, taking a deeper look at the labor city reveals that much of these spaces are overcrowded, squalid spaces without municipal infrastructure such as water supply. The timing of COVID-19 being within just 3 years of the World Cup created a situation where infrastructure construction continues as per schedule, so thousands of migrants are forced to live as well as work in close proximity to each other. This is a photo from one of the rooms in the labor camp where you can see 9 people sharing the small space, and conditions remain this way throughout the pandemic. So while the World Cup celebratory documents highlight its benefits of economic development and job creations, if we consider it through this lens of our historical understanding, we can see that without adequate reforms to the legal system, the mega event itself could indeed be a dangerous avenue for the continuation of exploitation of a large army of temporary migrant workers in Qatar. So as I mentioned previously, there have been reforms to the labor law affecting migrant workers, which have been championed in the celebratory narratives. So for example, Qatar abolished some of the most exploitative practices of the kafala system, including the requirement of migrants to seek their employers' permissions to change jobs or to leave the country. Qatar is also the second country in the Gulf region to set a minimum wage for migrant workers after Kuwait. Mechanisms through which migrants can lodge complaints against their employers have also been introduced and strengthened. So though these are a step in the right direction, these reforms remain largely inadequate. Employers, for example, are still responsible for obtaining, renewing, and canceling work and residency permits for migrant workers, giving them the authority over the workers' legal status. There's a disconnect between legislation and practice. Migrant workers are still unable to lodge complaints against abusive employers without risking their income and legal status. The state's unwillingness to hold exploitative employers to account throughout its history is still prevalent in the context of the World Cup. And the inadequacy and low implementation of labor laws, combined with the class and power dynamics between employers and migrants, create a space where abusive practices can still continue. Currently, 95% of the total labor force in Qatar is comprised of migrant workers. Since the World Cup was awarded to Qatar, India, Pakistan, Nepal, Bangladesh, and Sri Lanka together have reported 6,500 deaths as of February 2021. But this death toll is significantly higher as the figure does not represent deaths of workers from the Philippines, Kenya, and also a number of other migrant-sending countries. This number has also been on a steep increase during the pandemic, but Qatar's refusal to collect and disclose data makes it difficult to provide an accurate number. In discussing the 2022 FIFA World Cup, glorifying the event as a catalyst for economic growth and development is oversimplifying Qatar's political and economic spheres. The cost of discussing only the benefits is therefore extremely high. If we simply look at the economic gains and legal reforms on paper without addressing the historical context of Qatar and its power dynamics with its migrant workers, then we fall short in assessing how much work is required to protect labor and how deeply embedded the systemic subjugation of workers is. Thank you.